Friends, I, on behalf of Beyond Law CLC, welcome you all to yet another webinar, but this time it's slightly different from the aspect that we are having back to back, what we can say like a master class on the principles of contract we have done, and now on the interpretation of contracts. And like those who had watched the previous webinar, wherein Mr. Badrinarayan had shared his views along with the PPT, that was well received. And thereafter, we requested him, though he had already acceded to our request, that you should also share the interpretation of contracts. Now, the interpretation of contracts has always been one of the facets which generally as a lawyer, one feels as to how it has to be interpreted. Because each comma, each colon, each full stop, or I would say proviso, etc., changes the entire gamut and entire meaning as to whether each clause has to be read in together or separately. These are another issues of interpretation. One is a literal interpretation, one is a liberal interpretation, and one is a harmonious interpretation. As to how we go about the interpretation, they say the interpretation itself requires interpretation in terms of the requirement. And especially when it goes to a lawyer, they say that even if the words are the same, the lines are the same, each lawyer tries to brief in his own way. And that is what they say. The lawyer reads the clause and a good lawyer interprets according to what he wants. And the best lawyer is one who can interpret the way his clients want and makes him convinced to the other side without giving any expression to the effect that it could have been construed and interpreted in a different manner. Though in a lighter vein, why the commas, etc., and why the clauses are different. I will just give an example from Hindi, which is commonly used as. One is roko mat jane do and roko mat jane do. The entire clause in the clause can entirely change the meaning. And though it's a comparison with the drinks, they say one is even how you express the word changes the game. One says Tauba Sharab and next says Tauba Sharab. So entire interpretation all depends upon how you express it. And we thought then when Mr. Badrinarayan is there from the Lakshmi Kumar and Sridharan, he would be the best person to explain us as to how and where the comma and the causes and the clauses can give the different gamut and what is the requirement in that. Like on the last session, we said, even when Mr. Badrinarayan was saying the proofreading is required, we had expressed and deliberated upon. Then if the expression is different, if one applies as a lawyer, let's assume to a Lakshmi Kumar and Sridharan's firm, and he says that I'm a bidding lawyer, it changes the different meaning. And once he says that I'm a budding lawyer, it changes the meaning. Without taking much time, I would request Mr. Badrinarayan to take over and in his own manner where he elucidates the things in the right perspective, to take over the things because people are here to listen to him. Over to you.
Thank you, Vikas. Always a pleasure when I talk to you and I listen to your introductions. Like I said last time, today we are going to have an interesting session because it's the second part of what we had done previously. We had done principles of drafting contracts to start with, and now we are going to be doing the interpretation of the contract. And why are they two parts of the same coin? This is what I'm going to start. Like last time, I'm going to share a very short PPT. Like I said, I'm not the kind of person who likes to have PPTs in place because generally we are all practicing lawyers and we don't get an opportunity when we are going before the judge to talk from a PPT. But having said that, it gives context and it gives some basis for people to follow as we go through this. What is the difference between the last session, which is principles of drafting contract, and interpretation of contract? You will say, what is they're totally different things. Why is it, and what is the real need for having these two sessions back to back? Last time we spoke about contract drafting, and we had a very interesting seminar where we spoke about why contract drafting is different from other forms of drafting. other forms of drafting being forms which are used for the purpose of persuading or pleading with the courts or giving an opinion. Vis-a-vis a contract drafting where you're trying to tell the reader what is the agreement between two people in the most precise manner as possible. We spoke about how to structure a contract and what are the essentials of a contract. We also spoke about the building blocks of a contract in the form of representations and warranties, covenants, condition precedents, and definitional clauses, and so on, remedial measures and definition clauses. We also spoke about from the practitioner's perspective, form of a drafting is also extremely important and how you need to take care of that. All of this was covered in the previous session. The purpose of the previous session was to tell people how to draft contract in a manner that there can be only one interpretation possible of the contract. That is, whenever two people are reading the contract, they should try and be able to say, according to us, this contract means X. Okay. It should not be a situation where A feels it's X and B feels it's Y. Then you are in trouble because then there can be issues with respect to how to interpret the contract. So the first part of the series was to explain how you should be able to find a way by which you keep things in mind. So when you draft a contract, there can only be one interpretation. Today we are going to talk about a situation where somebody has drafted the contract, it has come to us, and we are now having to interpret the contract. That is, how to find the proper meaning of a contract when it is presented to us. It is intrinsically linked to how a contract is to be drafted. And I always feel that if you are going to have contract interpretation without contract drafting, you are going to be in trouble. So here is what I want to talk to you about today, which is with respect to how to interpret the contracts. I'm going to keep this again as interesting and as practical as possible. All of you are experts, having litigated in courts, having done civil suits, or been in some kind of contract negotiation, drafting, or litigation, to know from case law as also from popular understanding of how to interpret contract. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit on why interpretation is needed, what's the situations in which interpretation becomes important. Second, I'm going to talk about principles of interpretation, or what I call as principles of construction. We all know what a principle of statutory interpretation. One of my favorite books is Statutory Interpretation by Justice G.P. Singh. I always believe that that is one of the books that every lawyer should read in his life if he's practicing. A lot of the statutory interpretation, documentary interpretations have commonality with contract interpretation. Contract interpretation, to give you a sense, in the 1700s and 1800s, developed really from interpretation of deeds. Okay, deeds used to be the way in which transfers used to take place, and we were really having a lot of the principles of construction from this purpose. So, coming to this principles of construction, I'm going to talk about the traditional approach with respect to how construction interpretation took place. And then I'm going to talk about the modern approach. I want you to all to be keeping in mind that today really the modern approach is what world over interpretation of contract is coming towards. And it's a more pragmatic approach and something that you must be careful about. Okay. After that, I will talk a little bit about how you must go about interpreting a contract from a practical perspective. Okay, what are the things that you must keep in mind when approaching a contract? Okay, and some of the very basic things that we miss out, I will try and explore and talk about during this session. With this, I'm going to go and explain the next 40 minutes or so with respect to how to go about interpretation of contracts. When is an interpretation of a contract needed? We all think that interpretation of a contract is needed just before litigation is going to commence. That is, there is some kind of a litigation which is starting. We have all been asked to come into the room and we are now having to interpret the contract. According to us, definitely that's a situation where contract definitely needs to be interpreted. There's no question about it. But that is not the only time in which contracts are interpreted. Contracts are interpreted day in, day out. Many times our people are thinking that they're interpreting contracts. One of the areas where contracts are regularly interpreted are when there are going to be transactions happening, and during the due diligence process, a large number of contracts are seen. Extremely important in this situation as to interpret the contract, because it is possible that a transaction or a merger or acquisition may not go through because of certain rights given up in other contracts. Okay. So, for example, you have a financing contract which you already have with respect to the way a loan is to be given to you, or you've picked up financing from the market. That may provide various covenants, as we discussed last time, with respect to what can be done and what cannot be done. And that may put an impact on the valuation slash the viability of the transaction itself. Therefore, interpretation of large number of contracts happen when the due diligence process happens with respect to transaction. Last but not the least, regularly you will see that contracts are taken up for discussion and review for the purpose of understanding whether a particular action needs to be taken under a contract or not. Do I need to give a notice? Okay. Is there a requirement for example, a classical examples are in a lease agreement. Okay. You're required to make a payment on the last business day of the month. Okay. Let's say the last day of the month falls on a Saturday or a Sunday. Do you pay it on the previous day, previous business day, or the next business day? So there are a variety of situations where you will have very small but minor but important interpretations which will keep coming in on the day-to-day review of what needs to be done and what actions need to be done under a contract. Many times we have a tendency to draft the contract, sign it, and then keep it aside and not look at it. But most of the times, every once in a while, you have to take it out in order to be able to understand what actions need to be taken under a contract. So this is a situation where you're going to have interpretation of contracts coming into picture. Sometimes these interpretations happen many years after a contract has been entered into. Okay, the original people who were signed the contract are no longer there. Okay, that's the reason why interpretation of contract by third parties becomes extremely tricky, especially those who don't have a context in which the transaction had happened or the contract had been entered into. Now, coming to this, whenever I speak to lawyers, especially junior lawyers, my juniors, people at the bar, myself, when I was a junior, I used to be very scared of an interpretation of contracts. I used to be scared for the reason that I would not know when there is an ambiguous language in the contract, how I must interpret it. Should I be literally interpreting it? Should I be giving it a liberal interpretation? Should I have a purposive interpretation? What if, for example, there are contradictory terms in a contract? What if a contract does not cover a particular type of situation? What do I do? It used to cause me a lot of problems. And this is a problem which is inherent in every contract because, as you know, there is a cost benefit analysis ingrained in a contract. It is not possible for a draftee to be able to contemplate each and everything which can happen under a contract or every situation which may occur in a contract. Therefore, there are going to be situations which are not contemplated or not clearly covered in a contract. Therefore, it creates a lot of problems whenever you're going to interpret the contract. The second place where there is a lot of issues with contract interpretation is when you move from the objective to the subjective. Okay, many times in contracts you will have materiality clauses, reasonable qualification, best effort requirements, and so on and so forth. In those situations, what is the standard to be applied with respect to determining whether a term is going to be getting covered or not getting covered in a particular situation? Therefore, materiality, reasonableness, best efforts, and so on and so forth cause a lot of issues for lawyers because when you're interpreting these terms, there is subjectivity, come objectivity, which is required to be taken into account. And last but not the least, our clients always expect black and white answers from us. Okay. If you go back to a client and say, sir, this interpretation also possible, that interpretation also possible, this also can be seen, that also can be seen. Client says, why am I paying you fees? This much I also know. So it requires us to take a position. Okay. Requires us to take a position sometimes in very short periods of time where we don't have a full context based on our experience with respect to what the contract would mean and how the court is likely to interpret. This is the reason why you have to be extremely careful and you must have a clear plan with respect to interpretation of contract. Otherwise, you will get into trouble when you're going to be doing this kind of an activity. Moving forward, I really want to kind of talk a little bit about this concept of principles of construction. I use the word construction, you can also use the word interpretation of contracts. Just like we saw when it comes to draft contracts vis-a-vis other documents, there are significant differences between these instruments. One, as I said, pleadings are something which is to convince people with respect to a position or provide information to a client in the form of a memo or an opinion. Contracts, as you know, are documents and information which is to cover the exact position the two parties have agreed to in a particular situation. That very issue also causes differentiation when you're going to interpret a contract vis-a-vis other material. Why is it so? Why is it so? Ultimately, unlike a statute where there is public policy, other considerations behind, contracts are freely entered into without any coercion and can cover any and anything subject to it not being excluded from public policy requirements or any regulatory or legal requirements. So the gamut in which the contracts can be drafted, the way it can be structured is extremely wide. Okay. Contracts both have substance and form, and both are to be respected because that is what the parties have ultimately agreed to. So the issue that comes with contracts is to be able to get to the position where we are really going to understand the intentions of the parties when they are going to be entering into the contract. There is limited role for public policy to be applied with respect to contracts. So when you look at contracts, it's really something where the courts have to really understand what is it that the parties have really agreed to, what is the deal the parties have signed up for. That's really very important. The problem is that when you look at the materials which is surrounding the contract or just look at the contract itself, you expect that it is going to be written in a very organized and a simple manner. It never happens that way. I have seen contracts that are jumbled contracts. I have a clause which has got representations and warranties in which covenants are present. I have seen a contract where in the definition clause, obligations of the parties are provided for. So the contracts are never structured in a manner to make your life easy. Many times it is jumbled because the person drafting it did not keep in mind some of the principle that is required for the drafting. But having entered into an agreement, you must still be going ahead and interpreting it. The next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to read a contract. Okay. One, when there is an ambiguity. If there is an ambiguity, what approach to be taken? What is the traditional approach to contract? And the modern approach thereafter is what I'm going to do. Before I move further, you will find that many times lawyers use the phrase ambiguity and vagueness in a contract. So the contract is vague. So the provision is ambiguous. What is the difference between these two phrases? Very important for us to understand because as lawyers, precision brings a lot of clarity in the end result. So what is ambiguity and what is vagueness? You'll say, Badri sir, the same thing. Ambiguity means can't interpret, vagueness means not clear. So what is the real difference? Typically, ambiguity is used when the term itself can lend to multiple meanings. So I use a word, for example, I use the material should be light. Okay, light can be the nature of weight, light can be the nature of color. Okay, light color hona chahiye, or it should be light in terms of this thing. So this light word has got an ambiguity attached to it, an inherent ambiguity. The reason I embed inherent ambiguity in English context is because one word can have multiple meanings, multiple phrases can mean the same thing, and therefore there are always situations with respect to how to interpret this word in a situation. So ambiguity is always with respect to double meaning or multiple meanings provided with respect to a phrase. Vagueness is not with respect to that. This contract is vague. You never use when it comes to a situation of one word having multiple meanings or a term being provided in such a manner that it can have two or multiple meanings. Vagueness comes when particular situations are not contemplated or not clearly covered in a contract. Okay, it is vague vis-a-vis a situation. Okay, uh, it say the contract provides that anyone below the age of 35 will be entitled to these benefits and people above the age of 55 are entitled so and so benefit. It is vague for people between the age of 35 and 55. We don't know. We are not clear what was really contemplated. So whenever there is vagueness, you are looking at situations which are not clearly covered in the contract but should have been covered in the contract. Okay, that causes very big problems. Why I am saying so is, whenever you look at ambiguity, you're looking at what is the way in which you're going to interpret that term to give it a meaning which is going to be covering both. Whenever you look at vagueness, you're trying to find, is there an implication? Is there something that I can draw upon to clean up and cover up the contract if it is possible to so? Therefore, these are two different terms that you must keep in mind whenever you're looking at a contract. Is this contract clear in what it writes? Is it contract comprehensive in what it covers? Many times we make the mistake of thinking the contract is ambiguous merely because of the words being used, but not looking at the situations being covered. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Whenever you use the word ambiguity and vagueness, this is what it really covers. Then, of course, there is a traditional issue with respect to literal and liberal approach with respect to contracts. We'll see that in a minute what it is. Okay, according to me, this is a perennial problem, and it's a very important problem also. Okay, you and I are able to earn our daily bread because there is this problem of interpretation. There's no problem of interpretation. None of us are going to be able to earn our daily bread. So I was very happy that something of this nature. Of course, it causes anxiety when we have to actually apply it. And then last but not the least, traditional approach that we have with respect to contract interpretation is a situation where we rely on principles of construction, or what we call as canons of constructions. Okay, you would have heard of this word canon of construction, which is used for the purpose of determining how to resolve issues if there are ambiguity, vagueness, or issues related to interpretation of contracts. I am going to cover very briefly four general canons of construction that all of us should be aware of, and something which very useful, whether it is contractual interpretation or statutory interpretation, but more so when it comes to contractual interpretation. Noceter or society. Okay, we have all heard of this. It's nothing different or peculiar to what we know. Whenever there is a unclear or ambiguous word which is used in a particular contract, one, of course, you give a literal interpretation of what it means. You look at the dictionary, you try to understand what that meaning means. But many times you're not able to understand. Like I said, the pre-use material should be light. Okay, that it's a very ambiguous situation. How would you determine whether that light means it is heavy or light, or is it light or dark? That's really where the issue is. You look at, for example, what are the words being used along with it. Okay, so for example, the words used are the material should be light and transportable. Okay, that means that light really is going to have something similar to weight rather than color. I've given an example. We see that many times, especially whenever you're entering into consulting agreements, we are providing managerial, technical, or consultancy services. Managerial is human service, consultancy, human service. Question comes whether technical service is human service or not. Technical service can be a technological service, it could be through machines. But since technical has been used along with these two words, it will have a human element to it. That's how you interpret the word technical. Adjacent generis is also another word which is used. Okay, there is a difference between nostril ossicii and adjacent generis. Adjacent generis is a situation where if there is a word which is used, okay, along with other words, that is, the word used is more general, other words are more specific. General words will take its meaning from the more limited words. Okay, so bleaching, dyeing, waterproofing, or any other sources, any other process cannot be any process. It means a process which has got something to do with bleaching, dyeing, and waterproofing. Okay, so that's typically how you find a way of being able to provide this. This is again something which all of you are aware of. Now, these are two things that I thought I should put to all of you, especially for lawyers who are drafting standard form contract. You will say standard form contract, most of the time we don't draft at all. We draft standard form contracts only when, for example, you have a consumer kind of a situation, one to many, insurance contracts, banking contracts, and things like that. I always feel that we have to be a little careful. Many times, employment agreements tend to be standard form contracts because it is by an employer giving to large number of his employees. Okay, and that's again an area where you have to be extremely careful. Generally, if there is an ambiguous term which is used in a contract, which is a standard form contract, then the principle of contra preferentum basically says that the term should be construed against the drafting party. So if you have a drafting party who has provided for this, then he must interpret the term against the drafting party. Okay, that's typically how it is. There is a very interesting judgment of Bank of India versus K. Mohandas. I would recommend for people to read about this. It explains contra preferentum, where, for example, there was a scheme for voluntary retirement, or there were two schemes. Which scheme was to be provided for, where there was a choice between the two of them, and they retrospectively changed it in the scheme itself, and how the Supreme Court basically interpreted the term against the person who was drafting the contract. Very, very interesting principle. Other interesting principle that you must all be aware of and you must keep in mind is this expressio unis e exclusio alteris. Very, very important and interesting principle. Okay. I find that many junior lawyers think they're very, very smart when they draft certain phrases in a manner which allows for something to be done in a particular way, but not in an exclusive way. So they say, sir, we have drafted this very, very beautifully. We have drafted such that keeping in mind that something has to be done in a particular way, but it is not the only way. Okay. So I give this is an example here. Agreement shall be subject to jurisdiction of courts at Calcutta. It doesn't say Calcutta only. It doesn't say exclusive courts, exclusive jurisdiction of the courts of this thing. This is one way in which it is to be done. Okay. So always they come, okay. These are all they say, sir, we are very intelligent in drafting something like this. This we will use to the other party. They have to agree to it, but we can always argue later on that this is not the only thing possible. This is one of the ways in which it can be done. Therefore, it is something which can be used for the purpose of arguing tomorrow. That if I want to go to another, this is like a situation of Swastik gas in which a cause of action arose in Rajasthan, state of Rajasthan. They wanted to go to the courts in Jaipur. The question came when it says subject to the jurisdiction of the courts of Calcutta, whether it should go to Calcutta only or it can come to Jaipur and Rajasthan. Court, of course, said nothing doing, it has to go to Calcutta. What's the principle then? And how are you to be careful with respect to that? Extremely important for the purpose of interpreting a contract. According to me, 70% of interpretation of contract comes down to some form of this principle. You have to be extremely careful. I would recommend all of you to read through this and have a good understanding of this principle. What this principle really means is if certain things can be done in multiple ways, and you pick one of the ways of doing it and put it in the contract or material or statute, then it is assumed that you have excluded other ways from being done. Let me repeat again. If, for example, there are multiple ways to do certain things, and you pick one way out of those and specify in your contract, then the assumption is that you have effectively barred the other person from doing it in any other manner. Okay. And therefore, whenever it is provided in a particular way that something has to be done, and there are multiple ways, and you specify one of the ways, then it means that doing it in any other way is going to be a problem. It's going to be excluded. My father explained this to me when I was young in a very interesting example. He says this can be explained by way of judgment. He explained to me saying that when Ram had killed Vali, or had shot at Vali with his arrow from behind the tree, okay, and thereafter, Sugriv and Vali had a fight. Sugriv was in exile. Vali was running the Kishkinda kingdom, and Vali also had taken over all the wives of Sugriv and other people and all. Sugriv comes to Lord Ram. Lord Ram says that I will help you. They fight, and then second time over, he from behind the tree he shoots at Vali. It's beautiful when Vali and Ram have a conversation as two Kshatriyas on the battlefield. Vali specifically asks Ram that under Kshatriya Dharma, okay, there are only 5 types of animals with 5 fingers that you can kill and eat. Okay. And I am monkey is not provided for. Okay. So 5 animals with 5 fingered animals, only 5 of them Kshatriya can kill and eat. Okay. I monkey is not provided for that. Okay. How is it that you killed me for the purpose of eating when I am not covered under that? Okay. The provision he did not say means that only these 5 can be eaten. The fact that 5 are specified in the way in which it is to be eaten means the remaining should not be eaten. That is what it really means. Otherwise, why specify these five animals? So that is a real principle. It's from our it's a age-old principle. It's a principle which is ingrained in our own shastras. It says that if you specify something to be done in a particular way, perforce you exclude others from being done in any other way. These are the 4 principles I thought I will bring to all of your attention for you to keep in mind whenever you're interpreting, especially in the case of ambiguity or vagueness with respect to how to cover the situation. This is how traditionally we have been interpreting our contracts. We always go back to canons of interpretation and construction for the purpose of being able to determine what needs to be covered and what need not be covered. In mind, this most interesting and important thought and principle that canons of construction or principles of interpretations are great servant but dangerous masters. That is, you cannot apply the principles of constructions like rules of law or statute. These are principles. They are principles to be applied appropriately. The principles to be applied given a particular context. Principles to be applied keeping in mind. Ultimately, the goal is not to be able to find the correct application of the principle, but to interpret the contract in the manner which is most reasonable and most likely to cover the intention of the parties to the contract. That is the real job of yours. Your job is not to be able to come up with the best way of how to apply the principles of canons of interpretation. Your job is to find out what does the contract mean and what did the 2 parties mean when they signed this. In the early 1900s, okay, there was a big movement both in the US as also in the UK to move away from these applications of canons of construction to a more pragmatic approach. There's a very famous legal theorist called Carl Devlin, who basically had written a large number of restatement of contracts in the US, who basically had written a very path-breaking article on why we must be careful of canons of construction. He wrote that I can tell you that every canon which is present has got an opposing canon which you can apply with respect to every point. So he uses the word 2 opposing canons I can find you on every point which is there, on almost every point. And after that, he gives 28 examples of canons of constructions which are both for and against on the very same point. He says, how will the judge interpret if you're going to have canons which can be applied in both ways? Okay, and gives 20, not 1 to 28 examples he gives of why it is. And then he says we must be very careful in being able to apply these canons of construction, and we must take a more pragmatic approach whenever we are going to look at contracts. And he said contracts are becoming more pragmatic, they're becoming more practical. Going on the basis of canons of constructions is not going to be the way forward. So the first thing that I want all of you to keep in mind is when you're interpreting the contract, don't immediately jump to what principle of construction I can apply. First, try and apply based on your business common sense. What does this contract really try to do? And we'll talk a little bit about how you must approach this for the purpose of being able to cover this up. The second aspect which I want all of you to keep in mind is reasonableness. Okay, reasonableness. In modern interpretation of contracts and to some extent statutes, but definitely with respect to contracts, more and more the question which is coming from the courts is whether a construction or interpretation of a contract is leading to an unreasonable result or not. And more unreasonable the result is between the parties, less likely is what the two parties would have intended that meaning to be. Therefore, more and more contracts are being looked at pragmatically, holistically, and they're being looked at with keeping in mind what is the reasonableness that we must apply with respect to determining whether the result of the construction is in line with what the parties may have intended. More unreasonable the result is, more likely it is that the courts are not going to. This is a situation I'm saying of a where, for example, you have literal words being provided for. Okay, there is an ambiguity with respect to the literal words. We are not able to interpret multiple interpretations possible just because it suits one part of the party, they're not going to look at it. Is that reasonable or not? Okay, did the people, for example, okay, if a contract provides that a particular activity must be done, okay, and that activity is being has become onerous because of certain circumstances, whether the contract would still require specific performance to be undertaken, or a breach and some damages is good enough. Okay, a very very pragmatic and a reasonable approach to what contract, because ultimately these are not contracts are not between people of the government and the people on based on public policy and so on and so forth. They are business dealings. Ultimately, businessmen are quite happy to take the risk and are happy to bear the loss. Okay, this is not a situation of life and death, though sometimes contracts can be, but really the contract what they're looking at is from a business common business business common sense, as what they say, looking at reasonableness, whether this is being reasonable or not. The next thing which I find extremely difficult whenever I come to contract interpretation is this dichotomy between subjective and objective type of interpretation. See, the problem is inherently whenever two parties are coming together and entering into contract, it is a subjective intention of theirs that they are entering into. Okay, you may be aware of the subjectivity, you may be aware of the way it is done, and therefore you're trying to find an intention of the parties based on the subjective minds that they would have come together for purpose of entering into the contract. But the courts don't look at it that way, and that's why you need to be very careful as a draftsman or even somebody who's been given a contract. You must always step back and understand what is the context in which this contract has been given to me, what is the purpose of this contract, and then look at it whether it is covering the subject intention or is there ambiguity. Why I am saying so is, if there is an ambiguity or there is a problem with respect to how the contract should be interpreted, then the courts are going to look at the terms of the contract, that is the intention of the parties, based on what a reasonable person entering into a contract of this nature would have intended. Okay, so very very important for you to keep in mind that while the courts are wanting to understand what is the intention of the parties, the subjective minds of the parties when they enter into a contract, and if it can be interpreted from the literal words, nothing like it. But if they are not able to do so, they will not make an inquiry, call this person, you please come. 10 years ago, when you entered into the agreement, what was in your mind? You please come. 5 years ago, when you entered into this contract, what was in mind? They will not look at that. Looking at the words, looking at the purpose, looking at whatever factors that they need to look into, what would a reasonable man in this situation have intended this contract to mean? That's typically how they will start looking at the contract. Why I'm saying so is, many times that approach causes a difference between what the contract was intended by the people, which has been badly drafted, and what the court ultimately interprets and provides the meaning of the words to be. So extremely important for you when you're drafting the contract also to step back and say, Is this what a reasonable person interpreting the contract would have come to a conclusion with respect to that from an objective purpose? Okay, many times we get very close to the subjective meaning of the contract and lose sight of the objectivity. So this is a very big dichotomy which happens whenever it comes to contract interpretation. When you're drafting subjectively. When you're interpreting objectively. I must make one point, however, clear, and this is something that a lot of people ask me at the end of sessions or other places also. All of these are coming into picture when the contract is ambiguous or vague. If, for example, there is a contract which is crystal clear and the words are very, very clear, many of these principles, or say I will say almost all of these principles, will not be relevant because the courts will try and give the real meaning to what the words have been provided in a contract in order for them to interpret it. So keep in mind the literal interpretation always trumps everything else. Courts have said if you have entered into a bad deal, don't come to us to correct it. That is not the situation. But if the contract is vague, then all the different types of canons of principal interpretation or the modern approach are taken up for the purpose of being able to interpret the contract. The other thing that I always say is that please look at the contract as a whole. Okay. Many times we look at either particular provision or a particular definition. Sometimes the contracts are large, sometimes we are lazy, sometimes we don't have time. Sometimes the junior says that, sir, I've read everything in this, there is nothing in this contract. I would recommend that please see the contract as a whole. Courts always interpret provisions in the entire context of the contract. They never interpret on a piecemeal basis. Therefore, please be very careful when it comes to interpreting the contract and looking at the contract as a whole. Okay. I recommend that you please skim through the entire contract at least once. Okay. There are situations where there are contracts that are very familiar to you. Okay. Especially if you look at banking lawyers, they're extremely familiar with loan agreements, extremely familiar with financing arrangements. So they'll know exactly which clause to go after, which clause to look at, and where the issues are going to be. But you and I, which are going to be litigators or who have not seen the contracts in many ways in a particular industry, typically will need to spend more time. And the way you do it is you do a two-step approach. You look at the contract as a whole. What's the purpose of the contract? Why was it entered into? Ask questions to the client, ask questions to the people. Then, once you have an understanding of what the contract is, look at the clause. Then look for other clauses which will be contrary to this clause or which may qualify this clause or may curtail this clause or expand the clause. Once you have an idea of this, then you can go about interpreting the contract. Very, very important for you to keep in mind with respect to this. The next thing, which I think as a modern approach, we are seeing it expressly coming in foreign courts and impliedly coming in Indian courts, is this good faith and fair dealing situations. Okay, what does this mean, and why is it important, and why is that a departure from our traditional principle? In our traditional contract principles, okay, when two people enter into a contract, two businessmen enter into a contract, the general principle is you enter into the contract, you suffer its consequence. Don't come to court for the purpose of being able to say that this contract was not right, sir, this was not done, sir, this was not done in good faith and all. They say there is no obligation of acting in good faith when negotiating contracts. You can hold back information, you can hold back things. You need not, except if you're not, unless you're not committing a fraud, there is no obligation for you to come clean. It is for other side to ask questions. That is how, for example, today, whenever you do transactions or you enter into contracts, there is a lot of emphasis on asking questions. Please give me this representation. Please give me this warranty. Please provide this covenant, and so on and so forth. All of this comes from the fact that there is no implied obligation of good faith and fair dealing in a contract. However, the modern approach today, especially in foreign courts, and this is something which is being recognized by the Supreme Court in the US, by the House of Lords in UK, and very soon I feel in the years to come in India also it will come. In complex business transaction or business transaction which are not at equal footing, or in variety of business context, the courts are saying that we are going to imply this obligation of good faith and fair dealing. Okay, you cannot hold back valuable information which is known to you, easily accessible to you, hold back from the other side, and when they falter, you come back and say that I had no requirement for you to be able to provide this information in good faith. According to me, this is going to be a modern approach going forward. Today, of course, Indian law basically still has the traditional common law principles, but I find that the courts more and more look at liberal interpretation, purposive interpretation, and are always looking to see whether there is any situation where one party has taken other party for a ride. Okay, so very important to keep in mind. So whenever you are interpreting, you must also look at it from the perspective of whether the parties have engaged in good faith and in a fair way. Okay, that's an important consideration with respect to them. The last but not the least important factor that you must keep in mind, and where there is a modern approach to this, is we are all aware when we read contract law, first thing that we read is a contract has to be interpreted based on the contract itself. For all evidence in place, you cannot look beyond the contract. Additional information which is surrounding the contract is of no relevance. What you wrote in the contract is the only thing which is there. We also use the word this contract is an entire contract and various other things which are provided in the contract to say that there is nothing beyond the contract to be looked at. Traditionally, that is how it is done. Even today, most contracts are interpreted based on the very contract. They will not look at anything surrounding the contract. But just like when it happened in the 70s, 80s in the UK, and in the 90s in India, okay, courts, when it came to statutory interpretation, were quite happy to see, for example, parliamentary debates, were quite happy to see law commission reports, were quite happy to see other material to understand the purpose, understand the purport of the statutes. Okay, so for example, the famous cases in the UK, basically allowed for Hansard, which is the book which records the parliamentary debates in the UK, to be looked at for the purpose of interpreting statutory provisions. Okay, it was unheard of. Okay, in India, we look regularly beyond the statute materials, though we may not say it. Many times our judges are very, very intelligent in drawing inferences, but without saying, I'm drawing inferences like this. But more and more in contracts, things getting more complex. The legal, regulatory, and factual metrics surrounding a contract are being taken into account for the purpose of determining its interpretation. Okay, so increasingly the courts are looking just beyond the contract to determine what is it. Okay, what's the meaning which is to be provided with respect to this, how it should be done. Though again, it is not an established principle. Whenever there is ambiguity, whenever there is unreasonableness coming into picture, the courts are willing to peek and sometimes view at whatever is available beyond the contract for the purpose of being able to determine what the interpretation should be. These are in brief some of the issues surrounding the principles of interpretation. Now, last but not the least, when you are confronted with interpreting a contract, how must you go about it? And what are the things that you must keep in mind when it comes to doing so? This is the last slide, and then after that, you'll have Vikas take over. These are some principles that at least I follow whenever I interpret the contract. So therefore, always useful. Okay, like I said, very important for us to keep in mind what is it that we are interpreting and how we're having a structured approach really helps. First thing I always say is please get the right agreement. Okay, I have seen a situation where a lawyer gave a detailed opinion on a contract, many months of clients engaging with him, only to find when the opinion was given to the other side, they said this is not the opinion. This opinion is already expired. This has been replaced by some other opinion. Okay, therefore please ensure you got the right agreement. Okay, many times we make the mistake. Agreement aa gaya, cut, we start. Second, please ensure it is complete. Okay. Many times you look at the agreement as it is signed. There are amendment waivers and consents which are provided many times after a contract. You must read the contract along with it. So please ensure that you ask the client, sir, after this agreement, was there any agreement amendment? Were there certain waivers given? Were there some consents given to ensure that you come and arrive at the right agreement? Once you have the right agreement in front of you, please read the entire contract. Look at all the provisions. At least once you must have a look at all the provisions. Many times, especially in jumbled contracts, things which should be present in a particular place is not present in that place, it is present in some other place. Like I said, I have seen obligations in definitions, covenants in representations, and so on and so forth. Very important for you to figure out where is what, whether it is in line with what you think the contract should treat like. Third, determine the scope of review and the provisions to focus. Many times what we do is we either we go beyond the scope of what we need to do, or we don't understand the scope of, if for example you are required to interpret a particular clause in a contract, okay, you must understand that what's the purpose with which the clause is being given and what are provisions to focus. Many years ago I was given a employment agreement, and one of the clients who, many times clients think they are very very intelligent, and they are also, but many times uh, they have an ulterior motive. They want to narrow the scope of the review, thinking that they are saving cost for their company, okay, and therefore end up missing on certain. I'll give an example. I was given a contract and I was asked to interpret a non-compete clause for in an employment agreement. So I was interpreting non-compete. Then I asked, boss, why are you asking me to come this thing? Non-compete, why are you asking me to do so? No, 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 no. I have seen this agreement. I just want a second view. Management wants a second view with respect to non-compete. I said, भैया क्यों मांग रहे हो मुझसे? Why are you asking me for this? No, 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 no. After a lot of, I asked 2 3 times, and after a lot of reluctance, he says one of our key R&D person is going to leave, and he's wanting to quit. And therefore, we want to know whether we can stop him from going and joining some other company. I said, very good. But then I said, boss, ये तो ठीक है, but there is a provision relating to him being able to get ESOPs, which is employee stock options. Have you looked at those provisions? He was shocked. Arey, I didn't think of that at all. It will vest and then it will have all sorts of other problems which I will have. So many times, if you are looking at provision without having the context, or you're not clear about the scope of the review, you're going to end up looking at the wrong provisions, and you're likely to give less than satisfactory answer. So have a clear idea of what you're trying to review, purpose, scope of review. Be very clear. This is what I want to do. Once the provisions you know which you need to interpret, okay, have a clear meaning and look at the purpose of the provisions. Once you have that in place, figure out what is this contract, what does the provision mean, how it is to be interpreted. Thereafter, construe the contract as a whole, whether any other provision, whether this provisions are in line with what the contract is ought to be there. If the contract is vague, please take a lot of care with respect to implied terms. There's a whole session we can do on implied terms in respect of law, implied terms in respect of fact. Both have wide ramifications, extremely important for you to keep in mind. And last but not the least, okay, look at the legal, regulatory, and factual metrics. Many times, for example, regulated sectors, insurance, for example, or banking, for example, or for example, e-commerce, there are a lot of regulatory and legal issues that need to be taken into account. So contracts will be worded very, very differently to take into account these. So you must have an idea about that when you're going to be interpreting the contract. I feel if you follow this more often than not, you'd be in a position to be able to interpret the contract in a proper manner. With this, I'd like to end my session on interpretation of contract. I hope all of you got some benefit out of this session. Again, this is an area which is close to my heart, and I really enjoy contracts, drafting it, interpreting it, both as an advisor as also as a litigator. And I hope this was of use to all of you. So over to you, Vikas. This is what I want to cover today.
Yeah, Mr. Badri, as you said that it's quite close to your heart. I'm just reminded that they say that whatever is, though the heart is on the left, but it always thinks right. So, so the way you interpreted the things are different. The only issue as a lawyer or as a professional in a lighter way, when always does ask that if all the clauses within the contract are so self-explicit, so there is a feeling among some professionals is that if there is no ambiguity, then there will no litigation. So because they always say that amongst the lawyers, where there is a law, there is a flaw, and where there is a flaw, there has to be a lawyer, and that has to be me. So they want to think what to do as to whether the contract should be very clear or it should be ambiguous, so that it could be. That was all in a lighter way. I will just only till now a few questions have come. This is by Ajay Achotia. Sir, I am an insurance professional and want to know if the system of declaratory relief is available in India. Can an insured approach a court for interpretation of the insurance policy without getting into litigation and enforce action from the insurance company?
No, it is not. No, the declaratory is not meant in that manner. Courts have again and again said that we are not here for the purpose of interpreting and giving declarations of law. Okay, for that, go to a lawyer and get an opinion from him. Okay, then go through a litigation process.
This is by Manvi Singh. Can we protect ourselves from the doctrine of contra preferentum by including wordings to that effect?
Sure. I mean, you can do that, but if it's a standard form contracts, okay, and if you have merely by adding some words, you may not be able to cover it completely. You have to be very clear. If you're going to have a standard form contract, and if you're going to have obligations which are onerous, and there are two views with respect to how it should be interpreted, it will be interpreted against you. But definitely, you can have, say, for example, a principle of interpretation clause provided in the contract, which specifically says that any interpretation which is contra should be interpreted in a particular manner. But more often than not, if the bargaining power other side is low, the courts also in the form of public policy will come in and try and interpret against you. That's typically how it is. But yeah, you can try and work yourself around contra preferentum, but it's a bit difficult.
Is there any limitation in a fraudulent contract to sue in the court?
I'm not clear on this.
He says whether there is any limitation for if there is a fraudulent contract.
No, fraudulent contract, as you know, can have both civil and criminal ramifications. Okay, so there are varieties of frauds. For example, if it is forgery and so on and so forth, it has got one implication. But if it's a contract which is fraudulent in terms of misrepresentation with respect to subject matter, definitely you can sue in court. There's no question about it.
You can read that Justice Kuldeep Singh judgment, which says fraud vitiates everything on that 94 or 95 Supreme Court. Which said
that is an accurate but incomplete way of.
No, the question, since the question is an open-ended, therefore the answer is also open-ended.
I understand.
Vidya sir, is there any particular format for contract agreements like employment agreement, license agreement, hyper agreement, etc.?
There are formats available. If you look online, there are many of these are now, especially all of these. Employment agreement now is fairly standardized. License agreement fairly standardized. IPR agreement, I'm assuming, are again like assignment agreements and so on and so forth. There are a lot of formats available online. You can take it up. If you see 4 or 5 of those, you'll have a clear understanding of what each of these mean.
But I think that can only give a broader contours because that is general basis and a specific. Like we all say in law that specific law will prevail over the general law. Dr. Srinivas, how prenuptial agreements are interpreted in India? Is there any important case law on that extent?
According to me, prenups in India are not valid now. So we cannot enter into an agreement on prenuptials, though that will not be enforced in India.
I'm just checking as to whether somebody has posted on the Facebook.
Sure.
Meanwhile, Manoj Verma, is there any movement for a plain language in India like they have in US and the UK? Do courts in India prefer such language? Is there any such reference? What is your call?
Generally, I think, like we say, we're about 10 years behind when it comes to contract or even legal changes. So I think in the years to come, you will find that there will be a push towards more plain language in contracts. But today, I think we are quite happy to see both the archaic words being used and the new simple words also being used. So there's no real movement at the moment. You'll see that in the years to come, I believe.
This question is quite big and has various clauses. If you can just check it on the chat box itself by Durgesh Babbar, though I can read it also.
No, I was looking at that. It looks like this is a legal opinion that he wants on this. Should this clause be interpreted only for compliance applicable for performance of the specific purpose, or in general, the compliance in a whole on a party should be adhered to? Okay. Um, According to me, it can be interpreted both ways. Okay. According to me, this really means that vendors shall comply with all the laws and rules and regulations which are going to have an impact on me, that other side. Why should this person be concerned with general this thing? Of course, the person should be complying with the laws and so on and so forth. The courts are not going to say that there is some legal metrology brief for some other thing which will allow you to vitiate your contract and get out of it. So generally, they'll always interpret to mean in your way. But of course, you can always say that general compliance level is important for me to be able to deal with the person because of good faith and so on and so forth. But yeah, so it can be interpreted multiple ways. But I would say preference would be for a specific purpose.
This is by Prasad PK. In a contract, when we both have in a contract, when we both have indemnification clause and LOL, can we say that the indemnification obligation is still subject to the limit in the LOL clause?
Yeah, very, very. According to me, whole session can be done on this. Okay, limitation of liability clauses, have got limitations. Okay, and indemnity clauses have also got certain other limitations. Indemnity is always with respect to triggering events, and limitation of liability also with respect to generality of events. So we'll have to look at it, but depending on situation, it is possible for indemnity clause, because it will be contrary to each other, to then be able to say which one will prevail. And many times, limitation of liability may prevail because that is the true intent. Many times, for example, courts have interpreted which term comes last in a contract, which term comes first in a contract, and all of those kind of situations. It's very complex, but yes, it's possible that the indemnity clause may be limited by LOL, but extremely complex situation.
Large number of cases, it also has to be construed as to whether it will be in consonance with Section 23 of the Contract Act. Akhilesh, the liquidated damages can be limited to a certain amount. If any other deny to fix and wish to keep it remnant open for unlimited amount. I think he will have to revert.
Yeah. I think he's saying that other person denies. Okay, so what he says is that if, for example, the contract is not cured, I think, okay.
I will ask him to rephrase the question.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we will take from Lal Tejwani, are non-compete contracts valid in an employer-employee contracts?
Yes, non-competes are valid. Only thing is you must keep it limited in time and limited in scope. Okay, as you know, generally non-competes in India, especially in employment contracts, are otherwise not enforceable. But if, for example, it is kept in a limited fashion for a particular purpose, okay, then because it is not going to have a fetter on his job and his right to undertake his profession, it can be enforced. But generally, you have to be very, very limited when it comes to non-competes.
There was a judgment of Precept Mark versus Zahir Khan also, that is one of the basic judgments on the, not basic judgment, but is one of the judgments on non-competing clause, where Zahir Khan, the cricketer, was asked not to leave the contractual sector. This is by Harish Joshi. By having LOL clause, do courts in India will consider this as an accepted liability and may still consider unacceptability liability if any issue arises?
So liability will be with respect to things done under the contract, but unlimited liability will happen whenever there are fraudulent acts or anything beyond the contract. Okay, for example, confidentiality provisions, if it is breached, okay, which can be tortious in nature, there a limitation of liability clause may be excluded and full damages may be provided for. But all contemplated situations, limitation of liability is what will cover the situation. I think that's what he's.
This is by Akhilesh. I mean to say that can in an agreement liquidated damages amounts be fixed up to the limited amount rather than keeping it an open for unlimited amount?
Yeah, possible. No? Only thing they say is that legal damage should not be penal in nature. It should be a fair estimation of the damages that are likely to occur, and therefore, in that situation, we can keep it to a limited amount, right?
Mamta is asking what are the best books to read on interpretation of contracts, though you have recommended one by Justice G.P. Singh. That undoubtedly is considered to be a classic on this. Any other books?
Generally, I like to read the books on statutory interpretation only. Those are good. There is Craze on statute that I really like. Otherwise, there is I don't know if this is available. There is a book by an American author called Funston on interpretation of contracts. That's again a very old book that I have. I don't know whether it's still available, but again, very good book on interpretation of contracts.
By Pawan, can there be situations where keeping an ambiguous language is also beneficial?
Definitely. In many situations, ambiguous language is very good, especially if you cannot understand or contemplate in future how things will pan out. Then you can keep the language ambiguous. Typically, it's also something which is used in statutory drafting, that they keep the language ambiguous to a certain extent to cover future situations.
This is by Akash Pudij. While tax offs by the Indian government would prove effective in attracting investments in the manufacturing sector, do you think there needs to be improvement in terms of the contract enforcement when compared to other jurisdictions?
Definitely, there needs to be. Yeah, I think general feeling about with amongst us is that contract is not which we can get out very easily and need not be enforced, because we know that the court process takes a long time and it can take its own means. That is something which is there, but yeah, if we improve that enforcement, definitely it can have an impact. It is Firmston, Furmston, Firmston on contract, if I'm not wrong.
He has asked that about the author.
I told it right now.
I don't think that we are having any other questions, but still I will cross check. Just check it on the Facebook also. This is by Rajat Malhotra. This will be the last question we will be taking. Will handheld bag be considered as an accompanied baggage to repudiate the insurance claim by taking recourse to the exclusion clause that at the time of snatching the articles were not worn but contained in a handheld purse?
I'm not sure about this.
This question you can
Yeah.
this question you can take off Delin Joshna. You can also read. I can also read for that. A change of law clause was omitted during the contract negotiation. Would this prevent a party from recovering increased taxes when there is an amendment, etc.? The contract is not for sale of goods, so we can't take the benefit of Section 64A. What do we do in this scenario?
good question. Okay. Um, as you know, only question that we have to answer whether 64A, which is an amendment in the Sale of Goods Act, is in line with common law principle or is a derogation from the common law principle. That's really the thought process that we need to have in mind. 64A was basically brought in for purpose of saying that if there was any increase or decrease in excise or sales tax, then the increase or reduced rate can be claimed from the other person. That's the purport of 64A, if I'm not wrong. Okay. So it was basically a statutory way of providing that any increase in the rate of tax would not have any would be enforceable for the purpose of collecting from the purchaser whenever goods are being supplied with respect to that. According to me, 64A was a derogation from the common law principle and therefore was brought in for the purpose of saying that you need to cover this up. I know that for a fact that in supply of services, as also in GST, when change of law provision has not been considered and there is a transition from the old regime to the new regime, then lack of 64A is causing problems with respect to this. So my is probably is not in line with in line with the common law principle, is a derogation from it. Okay. And therefore, again, I can come back to Derlin after taking a look at it. That's really what you need to keep in mind. Whether 64A um, uh, is it putting in statute what was otherwise known in common law, or it's being put because common law provides that you cannot recover anything beyond consideration which has been agreed to, and therefore it is there. Now the only thing is we must, especially in GST scenario, because of the section 141 of the this is that anti-profiteering clauses and other clauses. Okay, whether you can argue that there is a requirement for the other side to provide this tax, but I'm not sure. Again, very good question. I don't have a clear answer, but I will have a look at it and then come back.
Reference of section 6A can also come into view of the General Clauses Act.
6E is what? Repeal and save.
General Clauses Act, the interpretation when it can be. Because General Clauses Act deals in the part of retrospective and prospective, how to go about it. 6A. General Clauses Act.
Understood. Samajh aa gaya.
Yeah. So thank you, Mr. Badri. As usual, it was spot on. I'm just reminded when Azharuddin came, he had hit 3 centuries consecutively. It seems that we'll have to have another third session to at least complete back-to-back centuries, so that people know that, like you said, there are certain clauses where it actually requires to be explained in an extensive, and the way the people are latching upon when you are sharing the knowledge. And during the time when it's the time of the lawyer to attend his own office, attending the clients, but still they are attending that, it shows that they have understood, because the lawyers, they say that understand what is better. So they are devoting this time when the clients could be there to understand where it will be helpful in the future. It is just like again in a lighter vein, it was said that a lawyer had a photograph with the pocket with hands in his pocket. Then another lawyer like Mr. Badri came to him. He said, what is the defect in this photograph? He said, as long as your hands are in your own pocket, you are not a good lawyer. Thank you for the parting shot. And tomorrow, in our pursuit to the conducting the webinars, we would be having a master, just like these 2 sessions, we will be having another session on law of divorce in India, masterclass on law of divorces, part 1, by Aruna Farswani, who is a principal district judge, Family Court, Thane, Mumbai, and tomorrow at 4 p.m. So do stay connected, and everyone stay safe, stay blessed, and enjoy the interpretations and the principles of drafting which you have learned. It will not only help you in the drafting of contract, it also helps you to draft the petitions and suits in a better perspective. So The all nuances which we are learning from Mr. Badri would go in a long way to sharpen up the skills professionally and otherwise. Everyone, thank you. Thank you, Badriji.